Hello, welcome to AP Comparative Government. This is an overview of the first of our six nations, which is going to be Great Britain. There are not note sheets with this. These are not intended to be lectures where you take detailed notes. This is intended to be an overview of the basics of the country. So when we think about Great Britain, there's three things that you need to take away from it. Three words: tradition, Thatcherism, which I'll define, and Brexit, which I will talk about. Those are the three most likely things to come up on the test. So at the dawn of the 19th century, Great Britain was probably by far the most powerful country in the globe. It had fully industrialized, it had a worldwide empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire was the saying that went, and it had a fully modern democracy in many ways. Now, Great Britain has become one of many European nations. Great Britain has many sources of authority. In general, we break those down into three broad categories: social compacts, constitutionalism, historical evolution, and political culture. Those are the three categories. We'll start with a few of them. Great Britain doesn't have a written constitution in the way that the United States does. Its constitution has evolved over a long period of time, which makes sense. Great Britain is a much older nation state than the United States. It involves things like important documents, common law, customs. All of these come together to form what the British call the Constitution of the Crown. A couple of important historical events to talk about. We talk about the relationship with king and parliament. Great Britain, over its history, has transitioned from what was very much a medieval kingdom run by a king to a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, run by parliament. Between 1215, when the Magna Carta was signed, which is a great contract between King John and his various nobles, granting basic rights to those individuals, all the way through the Glorious Revolution, when King Charles II was beheaded and Parliament fully triumphed over the king in terms of power. That was what we call the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Great Britain then weathered the challenges of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century to become the most dominant country in the world. Great Britain had a really long colonial history, a long period of time when it was colonizing various parts of the globe, lasting all the way from 1750 to 1914. Colonizing, of course, the 13 original colonies, which became the United States of America, large swaths of Africa, India, Australia, so on and so forth. After the two world wars, Great Britain developed into what we call a welfare state, where the state is invested in trying to provide the basics for its citizenry. So here you want to think about things like healthcare. You want to think about things like education, so on and so forth. So you think about this overarching strong state concept. Now, this is not where it ended, because remember, one of the words I told you that's important is Thatcherism. So when we're talking about Thatcherism, we're talking about Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. Thatcherism is a conservative backlash to social welfare programs. We'll talk about it a little bit more later, so we'll get into it. Modern Great Britain, that is Great Britain today, is much more of a coalition state, led alternatively by its two major political parties, the Liberal and Conservative parties. Liberal Party is oftentimes referred to as the Labour Party, which we'll talk about a little bit more. In terms of legitimacy, there's a couple of different things to take away from when we think about Great Britain. Great Britain is, and always has been, extremely class conscious. They follow this idea, or have alternatively followed this idea, called noblesse oblige. Oblige is like obligation, you can see that word, and noblesse has the word noble in it. Noblesse oblige is the idea that it is the duty, responsibility, of the upper classes to take responsibility for the welfare of the state and of the lower classes. In other words, that it is the obligation of the wealthier individuals in the country to serve in the government and be responsible for the government, and so on and so forth. This transitioned into what we call a welfare state, where that idea of noblesse oblige transforms. It becomes more of the duty of the government to provide for the social welfare of the population, as I said, education, healthcare, so on and so forth. The biggest example of this still today in Great Britain is the National Health Service, which is Great Britain's state-provided healthcare service. And there's a lot of controversy about the National Health Service, and that could be a topic of its own lecture, and so I won't go too deeply into it today. The last thing to know about when we talk about legitimacy is the fact that Great Britain is, in and of itself, multinational. While English is spoken throughout Great Britain, the nation itself is composed of several territories. Great Britain is England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland were, some not too long ago, their own nation states. And bringing those all together into one government has its challenges. We do believe that Great Britain is a country that enjoys a lot of legitimacy when it comes to its government. British citizens are by and large willing to obey the law. In the end, this suggests that they see their government as highly legitimate. The other thing that we have to talk about when we talk about Great Britain is, remember I talked about tradition. Great Britain's government has evolved over hundreds of years. This is a concept that's called gradualism, slow change over time. Gradualism is how we track the transition of the head of state from the king back in the Middle Ages to the prime minister today. A great example of gradualism in British politics is the expansion of suffrage. It's called voting rights. So the expansion of suffrage really starts with the establishment of a middle class during the Industrial Revolution. And so between 1832 and 1918, gradually more and more people were granted suffrage, which means they were given the right to vote. This change has not always been easy for Great Britain, but by and large, it has weathered all these changes without suffering through a major revolution. Another thing that has changed is the operation of Parliament itself. I'll get into Parliament more in a second. Great Britain has a two-house Parliament. So it has a bicameral legislature. Bi means two. A bicycle has two wheels. It has the House of Commons and the House of Lords. By and large, if we think about the gradual change of British politics, we think about the House of Commons slowly but surely gaining power over the House of Lords. By 1911 and still today, the House of Lords really can only delay legislation. That's essentially all it does. It can't pass legislation on itself. It's not like the Senate or the House of Representatives in the United States. It has no real sticking authority. The House of Commons has, by far and away, become the more powerful of the two bodies. Now, by the dawn of the 20th century, if you look at political parties in Great Britain, these tend to break down along class lines. And that's more or less the case still today, with some exceptions. The Labour Party was created in 1906 to protect the rights of the working man, while the Conservative Party drew most of its support from middle-class merchants and businessmen. To an extent, this is still true today, though, as I mentioned, with a lot of caveats. Let's talk about the economy for a moment. So, in terms of the economy, there's a couple of things that are important to note. The first is what's called collective consensus. After World War II, the British had an uptick in the spirit of cooperation between the Labour and Conservative parties. So what we see after World War II, roughly 1945, and well into the 1960s, is cooperation between the two parties. And this cooperation led to the establishment of a welfare state. And it also led to the British government taking much more control and a much more active role in the economy. Key to this is the Beveridge Report. The Beveridge Report was a report that was issued in the early 1950s. And it wrote, the idea behind it was that there should be social service programs. The state needed to be more active in providing things like healthcare, education, employment, pension, and other benefits. In fact, one goal was to guarantee at least a subsistence income for every single British citizen. Both parties, under the collective consensus, accepted these recommendations. And as a result, the national healthcare system was founded. All of this laid the foundation for a mixed economy. The idea being that the government would direct the economy without sacrificing the basic principles of capitalism, i.e., the government would be much more active in controlling the economy than, say, the American government is today. And the problem is there was an economic crisis in the 1970s, and that's where you see the collective consensus break down. There's a big split ideologically between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party that comes out of the 1970s. 1970s was a period both in Great Britain, throughout Europe, and the United States when there was wild inflation. So the amount, what you could buy with your money was raising at a higher rate than what you were getting paid. So your money was just worth less. That's the basic principle of inflation. The other big problem that was happening during this time period is this is when OPEC begins. This is when most of the Middle Eastern countries enter into the cooperative that still exists today that sets the price for crude oil. Energy prices went up dramatically in the 1970s. That hit nations like Great Britain hard. It caused high unemployment, coupled with high inflation. It was a time period of economic difficulty, which in turn leads to Thatcherism. Margaret Thatcher becomes prime minister in the 1970s. She blames economic downturn on socialist state policies. She slashed social benefit. She reduced the power of labor unions in an effort to try to streamline things. She was highly influenced by a concept called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a revival of classical liberal values. Classical liberal values support low levels of government interventions, so not a welfare state. She's very controversial. While her supporters often called her affectionately the Iron Lady, many felt her too divisive, and she resigned in 1990. The Labour Party finally returned to power in 1997 under Tony Blair, who initially is a very successful prime minister, but whose commitment to supporting the Iraq War in 2003 cost him his government. Let's talk about British social cleavages. Geographically, as I mentioned, Great Britain is a combination of what were originally 4 different nation states. Until the 16th century, England did not rule beyond its borders. And now there are very much differing levels of geographic division. For example, Scotland considers itself oftentimes much more independent than, say, Wales, for example. Northern Ireland is oftentimes tied into a lot of international forces and its relationships with the Republic of Ireland to the south, something I'll talk about in a little bit. I'm going to give you a quick example. In 2015, Scotland voted for independence, and that narrowly failed. But as I mentioned, the biggest social cleavage in British politics is class-based. Middle class versus working class has always mattered in British politics. Many conservatives went to quote-unquote public schools. That term is a little confusing. Public schools in the British system are actually boarding schools for wealthy students. From there, these students would transition to Oxbridge, which is a combination of the university names of Oxford and Cambridge. At one point, Nearly half of all Conservative members of Parliament went to either Oxford or Cambridge. Labour Party officials tend to oftentimes operate a little bit resentfully of Conservative officials who they believe look down on them. This has been a British thing for a long, long time. In the United States, political parties do not break down nearly as much on economic lines. In Great Britain, economic class is the most important social cleavage. So if you're going to remember one, remember that. However, recently there's been more tension in terms of ethnic social cleavages. The majority of Britons are white, about 87%, in fact. But the number of ethnic minorities are growing, especially concerning in terms of social cleavages. Ethnic minority Muslims tend to lack social integration into society, leaving them vulnerable especially to terrorist organizations that might seem to recruit them for their own purposes. Now, things have changed a lot over the last 40 to 50 years in Great Britain. Britons today are not nearly as supportive of a collective consensus as they had been in the 1950s. These changing political beliefs have manifested themselves in lots of different ways over the decades, but you can see some of them pointed out here, each of which could be their own topic. Now, again, if we want to talk about sort of the traditional breakdown of political parties, and again, one of our key words for Great Britain is going to be tradition, we want to think about transition and gradualism. The Whig Party and the Tory Party were the first real political parties in Great Britain, and they're quite old. And actually, both of those terms are pejorative. They're never used by the parties themselves, but just used by their opponents. The Whigs become the Liberals, which is our Labour Party today. The Tories become the Conservative Party, and those tend to break down into two wings. You either have your traditional conservatives, and then you have your Thatcherite conservatives. Thatcherite conservatives base their policies on Margaret Thatcher, and they tend to be much more conservative, nationalist, and extreme. For example, Thatcherites are very supportive of Brexit, whereas traditional conservatives tend to be much more lukewarm on the subject. There are other parties, I guess it's worth pointing out, in Great Britain. In fact, the Liberal Democrats got 26% of the overall vote in 1983. But because of Great Britain's plurality voting system, first past the post, which means whoever gets the most votes in the district wins, they only won 23 seats, which is 3.5%, so a far cry from the 26% of the vote that they won. Now, as a result, the Labour Party definitely pushes for proportional voting, which would give them a lot more seats. However, it is worth noting that because most British governments have been coalition governments, which means neither the Labour Party nor the Conservative Party wins a clear majority, the Liberals have experienced somewhat of a renaissance recently because their votes all of a sudden matter. When only a couple of votes in Parliament makes the difference between having a government or not having a government, then that matters, and your perspectives get taken into account. There's also a number of regional parties listed here. Sinn Féin, which is active in Northern Ireland, but it's really a Republic of Ireland party. I cannot pronounce the bottom party for the life of me. It's Welsh, but that's the Welsh National Party. And of course, there's the Scottish National Party. There is also, though it doesn't have a lot of support, it has gained some in recent years, the British National Party. The British National Party is ultra-conservative and opposed to basically any kind of cooperation with the European Union, which tends to leave them on the outside looking in, although, as I mentioned, they have picked up steam recently. Now, in Great Britain, you do not vote for the Prime Minister. You cannot. British voters only cast votes for members of Parliament. The Prime Minister, is not elected directly by the voters. Elections must happen every 5 years, though they are often called earlier. The Prime Minister has the power to call elections and strategically tries to call them when they think they're going to pick up more seats. That being said, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011 altered these older traditions. Now elections must be held every 5 years, and if you want to call an early election, you need 2/3 of the members of parliament to vote for it. I mentioned this a moment ago, but it's worth remembering that Great Britain uses a plurality voting system, or what's often called there a first past the post system, which means whoever gets a majority of votes in the district wins. So it doesn't matter if you win by 2 votes, you pick up all the votes, all the members of parliament in that district. One thing worth noting if we're looking at Britons and their ability to vote, with Great Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, obviously it lost all of its votes in the European Parliament and no longer has a sway over that, which is a tough issue, and it's worth reading about. If you're going to do any reading on Great Britain, I would highly encourage you to take a look at articles related to Brexit, because that seems most likely where questions are going to come from. There's political campaigning in Great Britain as there are in the United States, but campaigns are much shorter and much less expensive. Though it's worth noting that there have been several campaign finance concerns in the last few decades. Now, Britain has well-established interest groups. Britain demonstrates interest group pluralism with autonomous groups that compete for policymaking influence. British politics is also characterized by neo-corporatism, which is when the interest groups tend to dominate the state. The greatest example of this are the British call these quangos, or in other words, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. Let me say that again. Quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. These are advisory boards appointed by the government. Like all interest groups, their influence waned under Margaret Thatcher, but have seen revival in recent decades. Now, Great Britain is a unitary state. That means all political authority is centralized in London. Great Britain follows a parliamentary system, so there are no divisible branches of government like there are in the United States. As I mentioned moments ago, the legislative branch chooses the executive, so there's no real distinction between the two. Like in the United States, the Prime Minister has a cabinet, and while it doesn't vote, his cabinet stands by the Prime Minister in decision-making and policy-making decisions. Hence, the rule in Great Britain has always been this concept of the collective cabinet, the idea that the cabinet takes collective responsibility for the policy for the country. This idea of collectivism kind of goes downward even further, because the Prime Minister is supposed to be the one who speaks for the Parliament, even though they might not represent everyone in the Parliament. They choose the cabinet ministers, they make decisions in the cabinet, and they campaign as the head of their party. Parliament itself, physically, is kind of interesting. It's a series of benches that are separated by a long table that runs down the center of the room. By tradition, the table is actually 2 sword lengths long. That's what it says. The majority of the party sits on one side of the room, and the opposition party sits on the other side of the room. The Prime Minister sits in the front of his party with the cabinet members behind him. Facing him on the other side of the table is the opposition leader with their cabinet behind him, called typically the shadow cabinet. The less influential members of Parliament sit in the back and are called, tellingly, the backbenchers. Once a week, Parliament holds question time. This can get really heated and it's fun to watch. Members of the opposition get to question the Prime Minister. During this debate and other debates, the Speaker of the House is the presiding officer and is supposed to be objective. Above all, in a parliamentary system, the majority party must maintain party discipline. If a major vote comes to the floor and majority party members do not back it, that is called a vote of no confidence. And by tradition, the cabinet must immediately resign and new elections must be held. There is no strong judiciary branch in Great Britain, leading to what's called parliamentary sovereignty. Parliamentary sovereignty is the idea that Parliament's decisions are final. This idea has been called into question in recent years, as some members of Parliament have been less willing to just kind of go along with whatever their party wants. And this division has made it much more difficult to appear a unitary state. Great Britain has a large and sophisticated bureaucracy, and as a result, many top bureaucrats have significant discretionary power. Now, as I mentioned, as I was talking a moment ago about the judicial branch, Great Britain follows common law established over centuries, while the rest of Europe follows code law. In common law, when judges issue decisions, those decisions change the law. That's not the case in code law. In code law, whatever the legislative branch is, they pass the laws, and the judiciary branch simply interprets the laws. Until 2009, a group of members of parliament from the House of Lords were the highest court of appeal in the land. You couldn't go beyond that. These were called the Law Lords. But in 2009, Great Britain established a Supreme Court, and its sole function is really to be the highest court in the land, the last court of appeal. And its power is a lot less than the Supreme Court in the United States. So be a little bit careful about the name. It's not there to act as a check on the decisions of Parliament. It is there to be the last avenue for appeal. Now, talking about economics for another moment, we have two sort of competing ideologies here. We have liberalism. Liberalism has been the foundation of Great Britain's economy traditionally. It is the belief that the individual should be economically and politically free. That leads to neoliberalism, which is kind of the same thing except on steroids, and that's under Margaret Thatcher. So that's one economic perspective on Great Britain. Many would like Great Britain to practice neoliberalism. On the other side, you have that idea of collective consensus, the idea of the welfare state, the notion that the government is responsible for taking care of its people. And this leads to Keynesism. This is named after an economist named John Keynes. And the idea here is, and it's kind of like, again, collective consensus, but on steroids. The government takes action to secure full employment, expand social services, and keep the economy growing. It's much, much more hands-on. So if you want to compare and contrast the two, in a liberal style economy in Great Britain, the government has a lot less involvement in the economy. Under a collective consensus or Keynes-based economy, the government is intimately involved in the operation of the economy. Now, of course, like any other nation, Great Britain is subject to international changes in the economy. And so after circa about 2010, Great Britain, like many other European nations in response to the 2008 economic crisis, introduced what are called austerity measures. Austerity measures are very, very common. You see them a lot in different European nations. Austerity measures are nothing other than a reduction in public spending. That's all that they are. These were actually meant to end in 2012, but were still in place in 2018. These are 100% an offshoot of neoliberalism. These are neoliberal ideas. So again, reducing public spending on things like education, reducing public spending on healthcare. It also means reducing taxes because you don't need to bring as much money to pay for things. By no stretch of the imagination have these policies proven universally popular, and there's a crisis that's still ongoing with the National Health Services that, again, is too detailed of a topic for us right now, but is something worth looking into if you are thinking that Great Britain might form one of your comparison countries for the purposes of the FRQs. All right, the second to last thing that I want to talk about here is Brexit. All right, so Brexit is the major issue confronting the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is no longer a member of the European Union. The European Union is a supranational organization, so it can set things like rules when it comes to immigration, when it comes to economic policy, sometimes when it comes to different social policies. There are many members of the European Union in Europe, countries like France, Italy, Germany, Austria. These are all members of the European Union. Now, Great Britain has an interesting and historical relationship with Europe where it's always sort of seen itself as partly European and partly its own independent thing. This is not new by any stretch of the imagination. But what we see happening in Brexit is there was this building of tension between the political parties. And the issues at hand were, to a large extent, populist. Things like immigration. You were seeing a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe, especially after the economic crisis in 2008, when people from countries like the Ukraine, for example, were leaving and moving to a different European Union country, Great Britain, in seek of employment and things like that. Brexit was a response to things of that nature. It was very much a nationalist movement, a desire to see Britain for the British. So in 2013, then Prime Minister David Cameron promised a renegotiation of the United Kingdom's membership in the EU, follow up by a popular vote on whether or not to stay in the EU bloc. So the referendum was finally held on June 23rd, 2016, and it was a single question. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? The vote was unbelievably close. 51.89% of voters supported leaving the Union. 48.11% supported remaining. Almost 75% of the country voted. Because it passed, Prime Minister David Cameron resigned from his post. The biggest issue that is still plaguing the United Kingdom when it comes to Brexit were the terms of its exit. And what we talk about here is we either talk about a hard exit or a soft exit. If Great Britain were to leave the EU without ironing out things like trade policies, and something I'll talk about in just a second when I talk about Northern Ireland, that's called a hard exit. A soft exit is when they have some sort of a negotiated settlement. Great Britain has been successful in negotiating many aspects of its exit, though there's a lot of growing pains still about this today, and it's the most divisive issue in Great Britain for contemporary purposes. The Great Britain and EU remains the best example of a nation state corresponding with a supranational organization. So Great Britain remains the best of our 6 countries for any FRQ that relates to a supranational organization. That's why it's 100% worth spending a little extra time reading about the details of Brexit. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is devolution. Starting in the 1970s, the Labour Party began supporting devolution in the cases of Wales and Scotland. So this is giving different geographic regions of the country more autonomy politically. And over time, these 2 regions, Wales and Scotland, have gained more autonomy through the British government, though the British government remains essentially unitary, with all laws being passed in London. And then there's the big problem in Northern Ireland. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, Northern Ireland went through a period of time known as the Troubles. The Troubles was essentially sectarian violence between those who wanted Northern Ireland to join the Republic of Ireland in the south and those who wanted Northern Ireland to continue to be separate. So this often involved Irish nationalists who fought under the auspices of the IRA, or Irish Republican Army, fighting in the streets and through a lot of terrorism against British troops and British paramilitary troops. Unbelievably bloody and very difficult. And they came to an end in 1998 under what's called the Good Friday Agreement. So Northern Ireland has its own assembly, but the relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is unbelievably complicated and really tricky. Northern Ireland has its own assembly, but it was suspended for 5 years, from 2002 to 2007. Just how that authority is going to change in the aftermath of Brexit remains to be seen. And here's another reason that Brexit matters. When Great Britain was a member of the European Union, there wasn't any problem going back and forth between the Republic of Ireland, which is a member of the European Union, and Northern Ireland. There was a lot of fear going into Brexit that if Great Britain left the European Union without a deal, if it did a hard exit, then the barbed wire fences would go up along the border again, as they were during the troubles between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that it would be difficult to trade, to move between the two countries, and so on and so forth. Now, largely that hasn't happened. But just how that relationship between Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and the government in London works itself out in the aftermath of Brexit really much remains to be seen. But that being said, the interesting thing is the most poignant example of devolution was the 2014 vote in Scotland, when they voted on essentially seceding, on becoming their own independent country. And it narrowly lost by a vote of 55% to 45%. The voters in Scotland decided to remain a part of Great Britain. However, that was in 2014. Brexit wasn't finalized until 2020, and most Scots were opposed to Brexit. So whether this Scottish succession question is a closed deal very much remains to be seen. Many argue that devolution is only one step towards modernizing Great Britain. Many Brits want a Bill of Rights, written constitution, and voting reform with a move towards proportional voting. And how many of these reforms will come to pass in the remaining years is definitely an issue that we don't know yet. Okay, so that was an overview of Great Britain. It's a lot of terms, but I hopefully gave you a taste of some of the different issues facing Great Britain and ideas that may come up on the test.